Well, shooters and reloaders out there, Fortune Cookie 45 LC coming to you from the hot lead zone. And the title of this video is Sight Pictures. And this video was kicked off about a year ago, got into my video queue a year ago when I was at the range that had closed up since. But there was a shooter there that was shooting a Mauser. Now, before we go on with this, there's probably 4 ways to pronounce Mauser. And one of them is Mauser, and you hear that a lot, Mauser. Or is it Mauser? Mauser. Or is it Mauser? Mauser? Or is it Mauser? Mauser. Mauser. There's a lot of ways to pronounce things, and I know that a lot of you out there are going to get kind of disturbed when you hear a mispronunciation that you have, but the common Mauser might be a wrong pronunciation also. It might be Mauser. But it doesn't really matter, does it? We're talking about this rifle. Anyway, this shooter was shooting this rifle, and I got to talking to him, and he says to me, "You're Fortune Cookie 45 LC, aren't you?" And I don't think he knew that I was in his area, but he was quite surprised that sure enough, I'm Fortune Cookie 45 LC. And we had been talking about his Mauser, and I said that mine shoots high by about 15, 16 inches with reloads at 100 yards. So it shoots really high. And the sights are cranked all the way down, of course, and there's really no more adjustment. So in fact, he gave me this 8mm steel cased Mauser round, Mauser. He gave me this round as a souvenir. And he said to me, you could simply use the hood to use as an aiming point instead of the front sight. In other words, use the hood as a front sight, and that would make your gun shoot lower. And I said, you know what, I didn't think about trying that. And so he was a little bit surprised that I didn't even think of doing that. So when I got home, I went ahead and checked that out, and you know, if you use a hood for a front sight, you could actually do that, but the problem is it's very difficult to get a consistent sight picture using the hood for a front sight. So let's talk about sight picture. Now, a sight picture for any of our guns can be almost anything. For instance, a handgun can be shot at the hip, and if you know where that gun is in relation to where you're looking, then where you're looking is the sight picture because the bullets will hit there. And that's a sight picture. And have you seen trick shooters shoot like this? And they can break clay birds doing that? Well, they actually have a sight picture. It's all in the mount of the gun and where the gun shoots in relation to where the shooter's looking. And so that's a sight picture. And you could shoot with the gun sideways. You could shoot like this, with your eyes above the sights. And you're seeing the front sight, but that's a sight picture. So any sight picture that works for a certain shooter can be considered a sight picture. But there are recommended sight pictures, and there are problems with some of those sight pictures in terms of what we want to do, what our eyes want to do, this kind of thing. So let's discuss sight pictures. And I know that a lot of you experienced shooters out there won't get much out of this. In fact, you might find this to be very dry. But the fact of the matter is, sight pictures are important. Important enough that you see them posted on the walls of shooting ranges. So with regular iron sights, with our handguns, we normally will have a flat top post for our front sight, and our rear sight is a flat blade with a square notch, and that's called your partridge type of handgun sight, very commonly found. For rifles, we have a rear sight that has a flat top on it, or it may have little kind of upward inclines, because those are called your buckhorn or semi-buckhorn type sights, but there's a notch. And for a front sight, we often have a bead on the end of the front sight, so the bead is used for a front sight. So when you put the bead in the notch like this, and the buckhorns go uphill like this, but anyway, you got the bead in the notch, top of the bead is even with the top of the rear sight, and the bullet impact is adjusted to hit the top of the bead, so that if you're shooting at a bullseye, you would hold on the center, with the center of the bullseye right on top of the bead. And if you're shooting a 6 o'clock hold, then the whole bullseye is sitting on top of the bead, but the point of impact is adjusted to be a little higher, so the bullet's hitting the center of the bullseye. That's the way iron sights that are your so-called open sights work. And that's the same for handgun or rifle. So here are some examples of open sights: the Mauser and also the Marlin 1894 semi-buckhorn. And we like these sights, they work well for us, but a lot of times we want to use some aperture sights also. And front sights can be anything from a flat top post to a tapered post like on the Mauser, and also it can be as common as the flat top post is on our handguns. The bead type front sight is very popular on our American made rifles. So just imagine for our handguns that instead of a bead here, you've got a flat top front sight, and we can either have a center hold or a 6 o'clock hold depending on our purposes for target shooting, or whether we're hunting with a center hold. Now notice we can actually vary and modify our sight pictures. This happens to be a Smith & Wesson Model 25, and it has perhaps the best iron sights ever put on a handgun. Now why do I say that? It has a white outline notch rear sight, but the front sight has a nice red insert that allows us to do some very good long range shooting, as well as using the red insert to pick up in lower light conditions. Because on the Smith & Wesson sight system, you can actually use the bottom of the insert lined up with the top of the rear sight to put the target on top of the red top there, and use that for a long range sight. And you could actually center the bottom of the entire front sight blade in the rear notch, and then use the very top of the red insert to locate your target. And Elmer Keith actually wrote about doing this for some of his long range shooting. He preferred these sights. That's all part of the sight picture available to us with the Smith & Wesson end frame, the very best sights that Smith & Wesson makes. Now, as useful as open sights are, a lot of our rifle shooters today prefer to take open sights off, especially on lever guns, and replace them with aperture sights like this. Your so-called aperture sights can be mounted there, or on the back of the receiver, or on the tang. And these aperture sights are often called Peep Sights, and we go ahead and mount those on there, and we use them in conjunction with front bead sights. Now this causes a problem for us because most of our aperture type sights are used in conjunction not with bead sights, but with flat top front post sights like this. Flat front post, rear aperture sight, or Peep. And these work very well because the flat post is centered in the aperture, and then the bullets are adjusted to hit right on top of the post for a center hold, or if we're doing long-range target shooting, the bullseye sits on top of the flat post and the point of impact is adjusted to hit the center of the bullseye. And that works very well. So well that we use this sight picture in our national match shooting and our NRA high power shooting. Works very well for whatever range we're shooting at to have that flat top post centered in the aperture, and then the bullets hit are adjusted to be in the center of the bullseye. So we like that. And of course, if we're hunting, then we want the bullets to hit around top of the front post, and we're going to be using this sight picture right on the game animals that we're taking. And these kind of sights on our Garand rifles and our M1As, M14s, and M16s are superior sighting systems of all the open sight systems that are used in the military rifles of the world. Here's another look at the difference between an open sight and an aperture peep sight when it comes to setting up for a 6 o'clock hole for target shooting. Now, where some confusion happens is that suppose your front sight, instead of being a flat top like this, is a bead. So when there's a bead on top of the front sight and that's circular, do you center the circle there of the bead in the circle of the aperture? In which case, do you set the bullet impact to be in the center of the bead? Or do you use the top of the bead, and the top of the bead is the same as the top of that flat post there, and the bead's actually sitting down here, so that if you got a 6 o'clock hold on a bullseye target, you got a figure 8, and if you have a center hold for hunting or for target shooting, then the bead is sitting right there, and the top of the bead's right in the middle of the bullseye. Which is the way it should be? Should it be that way, or should it be that the circle of the bead is centered in the circle of the sight and the bullets are set for the center of the bead? Well, you could actually do it either way, whichever way works well for you, and you can do your most consistent shooting. That's up to you, whether you want to set your sight that way or not. But the commonly recommended way to set that bead up would be that the bead is sitting right here, where the top of the bead is centered in the aperture and the bullets hit the top of the bead, or are set for 6 o'clock hold above that for the center of the bullseye. Now, for all of your telescopic sights, your red dot sights, your reflex holographic type sights, all of those have an advantage over all of these sighting systems because there's only one thing to line up on the target with a scope or with a red dot. There aren't two sights that you're trying to line up the sights to each other and on the target. So you're trying to line three things up. With telescopic sights, you just simply put the reticle right where you want the bullet to go. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. The center of the reticle is whatever it is, and the center of the red dot is whatever it is. So those don't have these issues. So we're not talking about scope sights or red dot sights here. We're talking about iron sights, whether it's open or aperture. Well, we sure hope that all of this discussion of sight pictures helps all the new shooters out there. All of us that have been doing a lot of shooting for many years, we've all worked with different sight pictures and we know what works for us. So this discussion may not be really handy, but if you have something to add to our discussions here, by all means, the comment sections are really good to use for the benefit of the new shooters out there. Bye for now. Beam me up, Scotty.